Hello, my name is Robin Prudhomme-Bauer, and I'm from the League of Women Voters, Greater Verde Valley, and the moderator for this discussion forum for the candidates running for State Senate in Arizona Legislative District 6. We are pleased to be here today at the studios of Verde Valley TV in Cottonwood to have a discussion with the two candidates who want to represent the residents who live in Legislative District 6. Sylvia Allen from Snowflake and Tom O'Halloran from Sedona. The format is very simple. Each candidate will have 5 minutes to introduce themselves. Then we will have a series of questions that we have asked the candidates to discuss. And as the moderator, I will choose the question to be discussed, so I might change that up a little bit. But each candidate then will have 2 minutes to respond to the question with a 1-minute follow-up rebuttal. At the end of the time period for the questions, each candidate will then have a 2-minute closing statement. So we make it really easy, and let's get this discussion underway. The candidates have been chosen by a coin toss to determine the order of speaking in their statements. Our first candidate to speak is Tom O'Halloran.
Well, good morning, everybody,
Tom.
or afternoon, or since this is being taped, whenever you're watching this. I think I want to start out by saying thank you to the voters for participating in the electoral process. It's very important that people go to the polls, and no matter who they're voting for, they participate in our great republic. The second thing is, why am I running for election? And, you know, I served this area in the Verde Valley, Sedona area, and most of the district, actually, about 70% of the district, for 8 years while I was at the legislature, 6 years in the House of Representatives, and 2 years in the State Senate. As I left the Senate in 2008, I started to look at what was going on in the legislature over time. And what I saw was, in 2004, we reformed Child Protective Services so that our children in the state could be protected, and so that our families could have the opportunity, with the proper services, to be able to keep their children in home. What occurred was that there were such devastating cuts to the Child Protective Services program that we lost 159 caseworkers. We had thousands of cases uninvestigated, and now that the process has been looked upon, we have 900 and some children that were uninvestigated at first, taken out of their homes and put into foster care. And our foster care levels are at historic highs in the state, over 16,000 children. That is not good for the image of Arizona, and that is one of the reasons, because I helped lead the reform effort on Child Protective Services in 2004. There was no reason that we should have gotten to that point. Second reason is education. We during the 8 years I was in the legislature, we were able to fund education at higher levels than they historically had been funded. In fact, we tried to listen to the wishes of the voters of Arizona who had voted to make sure that we fund and have an inflation factor every year into dealing with education and funding. And in the 1990s, they didn't do that. Some of the best economic times our state had ever seen, that was not done. And after I left the legislature, that was not done. And so in the intervening period, we were able to deal with some of the core issues, even with the problems that we were facing. What were those problems? Well, in the 90s, the legislature decided not to fund or settle a court case called the Ledwick decision. That decision could have been funded or resolved for under $50 million. When I went into the legislature, the court had ruled we now had almost a $400 million obligation to pay. Not that we wanted to pay, not that we might have to pay. We were obligated to pay that $400 million over the next number of years. Then we had the issue with schools as far as construction of new schools and maintenance of our schools. We had a $2 billion backlog that the courts finally said, you must deal with this issue. And so over the course of 8 years, we had to deal with that to the tune of $200 to $300 million a year just to get up to speed on taking care of those issues for our schools. And then we had the whole issue of valuing and making sure we retained our teachers as much as possible. Then we had the job situation. Now, I don't look at this as a job issue that Arizona is to blame for as much as the federal government. But because they're the ones that didn't appropriately overlook or oversee the issues revolving around the mortgage industry, which devastated our economy in 2007, beginning in 2007, 2008, and on through that. Well, we're still trying to dig out in 2014 from what occurred there, and it did not have to occur here in America. And so these are the issues that I wanted to deal with, along with water and some of the other natural resource issues that I feel have not been dealt with appropriately by the legislative process since I left. I'm hoping that as we move forward as a state that we start to invest in our future, we recognize the opportunities that we should have to broaden and diversify our economic platform and to make sure that we stay competitive with taxes within our system. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Our next candidate is Sylvia Allen. Welcome to the area, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin, and thank you to the League of Women Voters. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Sylvia Tenney Allen. I'm a former senator and also a former county supervisor. I am married to my high school sweetheart, Richard, and we have 5 children and 19 grandchildren. I was appointed in 2008 and then elected, and then served till 2012, and then I was elected to Navajo County Board of Supervisors. But I was involved in rural issues for a long time. I've been a native of Arizona. I love this wonderful state, and especially rural Arizona. And I've been involved in the things that have impacted us terribly with our economy and jobs and all those things. My family was involved with the forestry industry, and I was very much involved and worked in that. And I watched as sawmills closed one by one, infrastructure was auctioned off. We lost 11,000 direct jobs finally by 2000, and $500 million a year to the state and our economy. I then saw the catastrophic fires start in our state, especially there where I lived. I had to evacuate my home. And the very owl that was used as a reason to shut down our timber industry also suffered in those fires and continue to suffer in the fires. So forestry issues is something that I am passionate about, and I feel that our county was very instrumental in working 5-6 years on the 4-Fry project. Mm-hmm. I also in 2003 worked on the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which did allow for us to be able to start doing these thinning projects around our community. I think we need to continue to thin our forest, bring back these jobs, and make healthier watersheds, and also protect our wildlife. As a member of the Board of Supervisors, I was president of the Arizona-New Mexico Coalition of Counties, and we worked as a coalition on our economies in our rural counties, and dealt a lot with, Tom brought up the problem with the federal government, and we have to deal with many endangered species that are being listed, and I think we need to reform that act so that we can protect our rural economies and our families, and maybe there'll be other times to talk a little bit about that. I was on the Little Colorado River Conservation District, the board, and we did water projects and soil projects, and it was very rewarding to see what improvements could take place. At the same time, we protected the economies and people's property rights. I also want to, when I was a senator, I was able to be chairman of the Border Security, Federalism, and State Sovereignty Committee, and I had some really wonderful hearings in my committee. And it became very frightening to me when I see that it just makes common sense for us to secure our border, and I don't know why we can send somebody to the moon, but we can't get that job done. And that's an issue that I'm very concerned about. I believe very strongly in education. All of my children went to public schools and to our university systems here in the state, and they're very successful adults. I have 19 grandchildren, and I really want to continue to have local control. I really believe one of the problems in our education is we don't have local control as we used to have. And we need to refund the budgeting process. No matter how much money we put into education, we have a hard time getting that money to the classroom. There has to be some reform of the budgeting process, I believe. I think one of our problems is there's just not enough money to do all the things the government needs to do. And we need to figure out a way to solve that problem. And we can continue to go back to the overburdened taxpayer and the small businesses and other large businesses that are carrying that load, or we can figure out ways to really try to build a stronger economy in Arizona that will fuel those revenues back to us. And that's where I want to look. I want to look outside the box, new idea, new energy, new ways of unleashing the freedom of our citizens, their ingenuity, their ability to think and dream and realize their dreams. And I really want to help do that, and to work in ways that we can bring about a new day in Arizona with some new revenue and things to help solve our many problems. I've always, thank you very much. I will stop. Had one last line, but it's okay.
Very good, very good. Both of you, you've brought up a lot of issues that I know you've given a lot of thought to. Many of us talk about it in the state, in the work that we do. What do you see, and we'll start with Sylvia on this, maybe you can expound a little bit more on some of the issues you talked about. What do you see as the most important issue facing the state of Arizona? You've listed a lot, but I'm sure there's one that's most important, and be as specific as you can about that issue.
Yes. I think the most important issue we have facing us is the fact we don't have enough money, okay? Already our revenues are coming in slower this year than anticipated. As you know, we make a budget on what monies we got last year and then what we project we're going to get this year. Well, okay, we're short again. That's very alarming to me because we had some good years after our $3 billion deficit, the 3 years that we struggled so much in the state. We had some better times, and now it seems like the economy is sluggish again. So I think that's going to be a big issue. I would really like to be able to think outside the box. How can we downsize, take a program? I don't want to get rid of programs, but how can we make it run more efficiently? Is it better to give that money locally than try to manage it on a state level? There's all kinds of ideas that we can look at. And I think we need to do that because we've got to keep some of these critical programs going, especially education. And I'll go back to saying that again. I really think it's time. Education budgeting is very cumbersome, very complicated. You get people in there trying to explain to you what the process is, and even staff can't hardly do it. And so we just need to figure out a way to really get that money to the districts so they can use it in a way that is beneficial for them, and see that we can get those dollars to the classroom. So we have, I think it's the budget.
Okay. Tom, what is your most important issue facing the state of Arizona in your mind?
Well, our revenues are important, but it's how we get deal with those revenue issues. Arizona has historically said, okay, we've gone through this 18-month or 2-year cycle of recession, and now our housing market will cook up again, and we're going to be roaring with a housing market. That has not occurred. No. Times have changed, and we in Arizona have to realize that times have changed. And so how do we find and be able to develop the economy of the future? We have an effective tax base right now. We have great courts that are business friendly. We have workers' compensation laws that are business friendly. I can go on and on. Mm-hmm. What we don't have is an educational system that is recognized across this country and that people are going to say it will develop the workforce of tomorrow. So I look at the educational system as the absolute foundation of our future economic development and diversification. We as a state must diversify. When I was in the legislature, that's exactly what we did. We brought TGen in as a part of a public-private partnership. We developed research institutions at our universities, and ASU is an example. They used to get $50 million in grants. They're getting over $450 million in grants on a yearly basis now because we invested in the future. Private industry worked with us to invest in the future. We have to recognize that if we're going to compete, we need to compete across the entire spectrum, and that requires a sound education system that's funded to the levels that are necessary. You just can't throw money at it, but necessary. And that we have quality teachers that we can retain, and we have students that a third of them don't have to have remedial education before they can get into our university system or stay in our university system and our community college system.
You've talked in this question, yours is both on revenues, that seems to be the key topic, and everybody's talking about it, and you're trying to starting to put some specifics together on this. You've talked about thinking thinking outside the box, and you've talked a little bit more about diversity and the value of education, and you did also. Sort of on that same question, your thoughts on what Tom said, or what you would like to add to the revenue shortfall issue?
Well, again, if we don't have enough revenues, we can't do the funding of education that we need to. And that's why I'm concerned, because it's not just the funding of education, it's keeping all of our other programs going, access, work enforcement investment. I mean, there's all kinds of problems that we have out there, so we've got to figure out a way to create more revenues in our state. As far as education goes, I believe, again, that if we could bring it back more local, for instance, I'll give you one example, but this goes back to the fact we've got to have jobs to do something to educate people to do. But we were so hoping for our potash mine in Navajo County. If that happens, there's a lot of movement to partner with our community colleges. I really believe our community colleges are very important in our rural areas. And to make a program where our people could go in and be trained how to work in an underground mine and to get the skills that they need, because those jobs pay very, very well, but we need a workforce that knows how to work in an underground mine. And we could partner with NAU to do that, not NAU, but Northern Pioneer College. We could partner with our community college to do that. And but the potash mine is still hanging out there. But so again, we need those revenues to be able to do the education that would be so wonderful to be able to do.
Tom, do you want to comment on all of this?
Well, it's not just jobs, it's what type of jobs we have.
Yeah.
You know, mining's going to be an industry of Arizona for centuries to come, because we have some great assets. We have potash, we have copper, we have the silver and gold type deposits that we've historically had, now at much lower levels. The key is we cannot continue to survive on service sector jobs all the time. Thank God they're here. Thank God some of our citizens can have those jobs. But the bottom line is we have to make sure that rural Arizona is part of this process, and that rural Arizona is recognized that we have, our children have a right to have good jobs in their communities. And that is exactly why NAU, when we developed some of these programs at the legislature, NAU has a piece of TGen up there, one of the world-renowned programs. NAU got some of the research institutions so we could bring that to rural Arizona and develop that framework of higher paying jobs in that region. That's why we have identified clearly that there's an important role within our national forest for our tourism industry, and that we need to maintain these forests at an appropriate level, and that the federal government needs to step up and make sure that they understand that when the Grand Canyon means $700 million a year in economic development for our region, that it has to be that way and get better. But the main thing is we have to have a vision for the future. We cannot just deal with today. I remember when I was at the legislature, the first day down there, we talked about the majority program, and people said, well, we can only look out 2 years. No, we need to look out 10 years. We need to look out 20 years and prioritize what we have to do and set identifiable goals and objectives for our citizens so that our citizens know what we need to accomplish as legislators.
Great, great. Well, this will be coming up in all the questions. Many of the questions is revenues, thinking outside of the box, and diversification, education, and such. So the next question is, okay, we've all talked about that. We know that on January 1, or when you take your seat, whoever gets the seat for LD6, is we've got a budget shortfall right away. What is your thoughts of how to go forward with that state revenue shortfall in the first quarter? Tom?
Well, the first thing we have to do is make sure that we fund education. We will go into the rainy day fund and fund that education. We will not appeal if I am in the legislature.
And that's the $313 million.
$17 million.
$17 million,
whatever.
Yes.
That the courts have identified, and our
Yes.
Supreme Court has ruled on this. This idea that we're going to appeal it and put off to the future and continue to hurt education is just, it's not good for our children, it's not good for our state. Then we have to deal with the actual programs that we need to prioritize as a state and have this public discussion of how we're going to deal with this stuff. Not these sound bites of 30-second sound bites that you see in all these ads and stuff, but the reality of a public discussion on where we want Arizona to go, what the legislature feels are the priorities of the system, and identify, because those are priorities, what we are going to cut and what we're not going to cut, and we have to invest in the future, and then identify how we reform our taxing structure. And we've been talking about it. There's been other groups that have done it in the past. In the early 90s, our taxing structure was reviewed. Nothing was done. In the late 90s, our taxing structure was reviewed. Nothing was done. There was no political will to look at the voters and say, we need to deal with this today, now. And so that's what we need to do, is have this broad conversation. We can get through this year. It's 2016. That's going to be the challenge. In 2017, that's going to be the challenge. And 2020, that's going to be a challenge, because we have to find how we move our state forward. And if we don't understand that a diversified economy is the only way we're going to be able to help diversify our tax base, then we're going to have problems down the line.
Sylvia?
Well, on the 2% inflation, I do believe the state should appeal it, and for one reason. During the good years, though, there was more than 2% paid. It was only during the 3 years where we had the $3 billion deficit, which there was a lot of reasons why we got into that. Not just because the economy tanked and we had our recession, but because the state, for 4 years previously, upped the budget almost $1 billion extra every year and got us into such a position that when the economy did fail, we then had problems. So we have to be really careful. Anyway, back to the 2%. It's not the state that has to pay it. It's the taxpayers. Who pays these bills? It's the people out there. It's the businesses that are going to have to pay the bills. Do we need to pay the back if the court asks? Of course they do. I'm not saying that, but I am saying the state should ask for the court to look at all the years, not just the 3 years they weren't able to pay the 2%. Because during that time, it was a crisis, and it was very difficult to figure out how to balance that budget. And if we would have put that burden back onto the people and gone to the people for $3 billion, then we would have lost more than 600,000 jobs that we lost. So it was a very difficult time, and that all should be taken into consideration. So when we go to figure out how to pay it, we're going to have to be cautious and careful, and hopefully the courts will see and give credit to the state and to the taxpayer for when those monies were paid, there were more money paid. And so it evens out, so it balances out.
I hear that. Tom, do you want to respond?
I do. Earlier on, I clearly identified that the state was not living up to its obligation. We were not dealing with the building of new schools. We were not dealing with the maintenance of our schools. In fact, Cottonwood School District right here in the area used to have a capital budget of $1.2 million a year. It has a $200,000 capital budget right now, and we are, as a state, not dealing with these real issues that are occurring today. We did not fund for inflation in the good years. The best years we had, we did not fund for inflation, the dot-com years in the 1990s. And so the idea that we are going to continue down this path of not funding. And in a newspaper article in the Arizona Daily Sun, my opponent suggested that maybe the way to deal with this for schools is to raise property tax, not property taxes, sales taxes. And, I don't know. That's part of that public debate we have to have. But I am happy to see that's one of the debates that Mrs. Allen wants to have.
I do want to have a debate on reforming how we budget education. And back to this building schools, that was a fiasco. Do you know that they built a high school that nobody came to? We wasted a lot of money when we created that. We should have taken that money and given it locally right to the districts that need it. That's the kind of reform I want to do. I want to take this money and give it right to the districts and allow the school boards and the parents to have a say in how that money is spent and how it's handled. We do need to figure out how to fund education without it being on the total backs of property. We only have 14% property in this state, so it's important that we figure out a way. But I want to see it really get to the classroom, because you know what? All these years, even the last 3 years, we funded it higher and higher the last 3 years. That money still has not got to the classroom. We need to figure out why. And I think that's through reforming the entire budgeting process.
I'm going to throw this in here because we've talked about reforming education funding, and it wasn't necessarily a question, but you've talked about, so one more minute to each one of you to talk about education funding, some of your ideas you want to put out for reforming education funding, because people on both sides of the political aisle speak to that. So Tom, 1 minute for that, and then Sylvia.
I don't want to reform only the education budget.
Okay.
You cannot reform 50% of the budget and not reform the entire budget structure. Okay. You have to look at the entire spectrum of what our process is. We need to simplify the economics of education funding. It's very complicated for legislators to understand, let alone the general public. So I want to reform our tax structure and our revenue streams and how we prioritize into the future. But I will say that the schools have always been involved in the building of their new schools. They identify when the school is needed. They identify how the building is going to look. The state identifies how much money we will contribute to that process, and then the local schools say we are going to find other revenue if it is above the state levels of funding. And that was reformed during my time at the legislature. Before that, Mrs. Allen is right. But during my time at the legislature, we reformed that entire system.
Sylvia.
I think in talking about just reforming the budgeting process, I think we need to reform a lot of things about education. And part of it is, I'm going to go back to local control. This year, my friend and I started a little charter school, a public charter school, and it's just 55 students. And it is a wonderful little school, but we wanted to do a strong, traditional, basic education. And we did. Our English reading and math program is very strong in the basics. I want to be able to really give back this local control, and it's not anymore. The state has taken more and more control away from districts. The federal government's got their nose in it really, really strong. And I think that, again, if we can reform, not only if we can really truly bring back local control, it'll bring back new energy to education, empower parents, and I believe in high standards, but I do not believe in nationalizing education or making our children common.
Well, we just moved into that next question, didn't we, about the Common Core program.
Yes.
We've seen high-stakes standing testing in the state of Arizona for several, sort of the mantra for several years. AIMS is the current one. Common Core has been the program that's been developed nationally with the input of a number of different organizations and people. Talk about that. You've talked about dismantling it. I'd like to hear where Tom stands on this, and if it's not Common Core, what is it? And I'll let Sylvia start with that. And then to Tom.
We come up ever so many years with some new gimmick because somehow our education just isn't cutting it. And so we come up with a new gimmick, and we start forcing these teachers to retrain. They have to teach to a new test. They shouldn't be teaching to a test. They should just be teaching children and using their energy and their talents and their to go into that classroom and teach strong, basic, good education. We want these kids to have a strong foundation, so when they get up into high school or college, they're ready. They're ready for their field of endeavors that they're going into. And then we spend millions changing the whole system, coming up with new curriculum, coming up with the new test. And for years we had AIMS. That was going to be the big answer to everything. And No Child Left Behind was going to be the big answer to everything. I think just get out of the way and let our teachers really teach and do the love that they have being with these children and get back to good, strong, basic education, more locally controlled. That's what I think needs to happen with education. And another thing I want to say, we really keep hitting on Arizona and the education, yet we have some of the top schools in the whole country are from Arizona. I told you about my children being very successful adults. One graduated from ASU as an electrical engineer. He's got 5 patents. My daughter did her schooling online as a nurse. My son-in-law died last year, and she knew that she was going to have to prepare to take care of 5 children. And she did her education online. We have all kinds of opportunities in this state, and people are availing themselves of those things, and they are getting educated and being able to do what they need to do. Do I think we need to improve? Of course. But he wants to, I don't want to go more nationalized, more control of the state or the feds over education. I want to go more local control.
Tom.
Well, I don't want the federal government in control of our children's education. I want the parents and the local school boards in control, and the teachers to be able to provide the education that's necessary. The problem is that we haven't done that on a larger scale in Arizona. We have not appropriately funded our educational system, 48th, 49th in funding on a consistent basis, and no idea of how we're going to get out of that. And if we are we're in competition, our children are in competition. I want to see our children succeed at life. And if our children are going to succeed at life, just like a business has to succeed, they need to know what their competition is doing. So I am in favor of making sure that we have stringent standards for our children to meet, and that they are able to be compared to other states that we are in competition with for economic development, and where our children, if we don't have the jobs in Arizona, are going to have to go into these states and compete. But I want the jobs in Arizona. And we are going to get those jobs in Arizona if we can show that we can deal with the competition and we have the workforce development that's necessary. Most importantly is I want us, the people that are making these decisions on education for funding and education regulation. We make those decisions at the legislature, not somebody else. And we should be held accountable. We should have identifiable goals and objectives for our citizens to say, why aren't you meeting these goals and objectives that you set up? Why are our children still having to not get the appropriate education that's necessary for them to succeed in life? And if we care about families, we want our children and their families in the future to be successful in life. And the only way to do that is to improve our literacy rate within the state and bring in better economic development. Stringent standards will do that. But I don't want to blame the children, and I don't want to blame our teachers. I want to make sure where the blame goes, if we don't achieve this, right to the people that are to blame, and that's the legislators and the people that control the system.
I don't think that we blame the legislator and the people that control the system because they are dealing with a certain amount of money, and that there's a lot of competition for it, especially healthcare now is a huge competition. Why is this state 48 in ranking and being able to fund education? First off, this state is at a disadvantage compared to other eastern and midwestern states. We have 14% private property. And when you take that in consideration, in other states that are able to use 90% of their land and being able to bring resource in, and they're able to have more property that they can tax, they can fund their education higher. It goes back to my opening statement about that we need to figure out how to get more revenue into the state so we have more money to fund our education. But I'll tell you this, I'll put our kids up against anybody in this country and anybody in any country in the world. Our kids are great, and they are succeeding, and if they have the will and the drive and the determination, they can succeed in the state in education.
Tom.
Well, to not hold the legislature accountable is we wake up every January 1st and say we have to have a budget, and 50% of that budget is education. That's just K-12. Forget the university structure. And it's an integral part of our entire budget process. We are responsible for the budget. So we should be measured as elected officials, measured against that some kind of a level of why you are or are not doing your job. In fact, we should have goals and objectives across the board. People shouldn't be wondering what the legislature is doing or why they aren't achieving and prioritizing issues. If anybody's held accountable, it should be the people that are in elected office. We ask the voters to vote for us, and we are accountable to them and should find ways of making sure that they know how to hold us accountable.
That's great. That's great from both of you. The discussion is wonderful, and I know that we could spend all hour on this, but I kind of wanted to move us into some of the other issues that you've both talked about, and one is really speaks, I think, to rural Arizona is Arizonans want, we know, increased job opportunities. We hear that every day. And we want training programs. I don't disagree with either one of you in terms of our community colleges and how they can play a role in that. We want lower business taxes, or we want new taxing structure. In Arizona, over 95% of businesses are small businesses, what they consider small business or small business owners. What will you do to help small business owners create jobs, especially those in rural communities? Tom?
Well, one of the things we have to do is make sure the Arizona Commerce Authority works in rural Arizona. It's not just for the municipal areas, of large municipal areas, Maricopa County, Pima County. They need to work harder in rural Arizona because our challenge is greater in rural Arizona. We don't have the economic base, we don't have the property tax base that these larger municipal areas have. So that entire Commerce Authority process has to be reviewed, looked at, and from the perspective of rural Arizona. We have to make sure that we have a fair educational funding program. One of those high-rises down in Phoenix can take up the entire tax base for a town of Clarkdale. And so this whole idea that we don't try to spread the wealth around this entire state. There's over 1.25 million people that live in rural Arizona. And we service a lot of the city needs in this state, the water needs, the recreational needs. We need to be a bigger level of part of the pie in rural Arizona. And we need to identify clearly how we become part of that pie. We need to understand that the tax structure in the state is important for rural Arizona just as it is important for the large corporations in municipal areas. Our small businesses are taxed at the same rate as they are. And we brought that rate down, by the way, from 25% to 20% while I was at the legislature, the first time that was ever done in history, because of the burden that was placed on our small businesses in this state. And so we need to deal with the realities of those types of issues. And it goes into the whole funding process, and then we have to find out how we incentivize our rural Arizona businesses to make sure that, if nothing else, they're marketed across this nation, just as the large businesses are out of urban areas.
Sylvia?
Well, it isn't just the state that needs to worry about this, because we need to pull the counties and the cities into it too. We need to all get together and work on this economic development. I talked to a friend who was building a new business a few years ago. She had a budget. She had gone through great lengths to get her capital to be able to invest and start this business. As she gets into the process, her plans called for a $150,000 air-vac system. By the time she got through, the county insisted on a $450,000 air-vac system. It took her 9 months delay, no money for inventory when she opened, and then now she's paying a pretty high rate for property tax. She can be very discouraged at times, wondering if her business is going to work. We have to look at what we're doing on a local level as well as a state level in regulations and the things that we're requiring these businesses to do. We need them to be able to get in business quickly. Don't delay somebody 9 months. To help them get through the process. Be somebody that's there willing to see them be successful, because that's what we are. We're public servants, and we want to help people be successful in whatever they're doing. Do it right. but do it on a timely manner. So I think this is something we all need to work on as a state. Back to the tax situation, of course, I think we need to streamline our taxes. They need to be fair. They need to be equal. We need to be sure we're not making winners and losers when we do certain economic gimmicks or packages that we're doing for people. We don't want to put the burden on existing businesses because we're going to make it better for a new business coming in. We got to look at all these things and be careful about the new businesses as well as the old businesses.
Tom.
Oh, that business that Mrs. Allen was talking about, they were told by the city, Camp Verde, that they could have a $150,000 system. The county comes in town property, town jurisdiction, and says, no, it's $450,000. That is just ludicrous. And something needs to be done about those issues, and that's where a legislator comes into the picture and says, what can we do? Why did this problem occur, and let's get it fixed. But the bottom line is still that if the state doesn't help rural Arizona as much as it helps urban areas, we will not have the expertise to deal with these issues. We have NACOG, we have all these other groups that work together on all these issues on a daily basis. They coordinate the processes. The mayors in northern Arizona all work together to try to deal with economic development. Our economic directors try to deal with it. But they can only get so far on their own. We have a limited revenue structure in every city and town, every county in rural Arizona. They are stretched to the maximum. We need people from around the state to recognize the value of rural Arizona.
Sylvia.
Well, and I don't disagree with much of what he said, but I think a lot of the problem is that we just have creating too much government all the way around. Especially the federal government's involved in a lot of this. In regulating our air and our water. We've got a problem with EPA, with the waters of the U.S. We've got problems with them shutting down our power plants, the units, our coal units. That affects our economy. There's many things with the federal government that we need to figure out how to reform some of those programs and get our congressional delegation working on that to help us as we try to move forward in our state to make a wonderful free market business environment for everybody here. So I believe the state also should get very much involved in some federal issues in trying to encourage reform on a federal level to help us with the things I mentioned there.
Thank you both. It's predicted that the Legislative District 6 area is going to see a large growth in population probably over the next decade. Recognizing that conservation and reuse of water can only go so far, how do you propose balancing the demand for this growth against the need not to outrun our water supply? And I'll start with Sylvia on this.
Well, I mentioned it a little bit. I think you're very blessed here in the Verde Valley. You have a good supply of water here, and that's great. And we have water up in Navajo County too. And of course, we've got to see how we manage that over the years. It's very important. But when we're talking about economic growth on one hand, and then we start worrying about growth on another hand, we've got to be really careful how we bring those two together. And again, I mentioned the federal government being involved in, I think, having a big hand in not allowing us to get to our water. I had a friend call me who's over 100 years has been ranching up in the Alpine Blue area. And because of a jumping mouse, suddenly he's being told that his cattle cannot get up to the water there on the Black River. And they've narrowed it down to 12 feet. Now, what kind of problems is that going to create for the cows to get up into 12 feet of access to the water? These kind of things just go beyond common sense, and yet they've made the fence to where the elk and the deer can get in there fine by jumping it. And so we are going to have problems more and more. There's two snakes that are being listed, fish. There's all kinds of things that are impacting our ability to use the water. Another thing we can do that would help the water is thinning our forest. Be aggressively in thinning that. SRP is working on all kinds of issues having to do with protecting our watersheds, increasing our watersheds because of thinning our forest. That could help us out a lot with our water issues. And I believe Dr. Julius Simon, I loved reading his stuff because it was so full of hope. But he made a statement that a free people do not exhaust resources, they create them. And I go back to just saying that we need to free up our government and allow people to get out there and be able to do things. And I think that we will see our future much brighter if we can just get rid of some of these excessive regulations.
Tom.
Well, it's not just about regulation. We do have, in many areas, excessive regulation. It's about finding that balance between the needs of our communities and the needs to make sure we understand our economies in rural Arizona, and make sure that we understand that these forests need to be maintained not only for our tourism industry, but as our watersheds. And we need to understand that we are a target now and into the future. We do have great water resources, and it's some of the cheapest water in Arizona. And municipal areas, when they start to identify what it's going to cost them in the future, we may become a target again. So we have to protect ourselves on our groundwater and make sure we have the groundwater and not them. We need to maintain our streams and creeks. They are a viable part of our quality of life, a viable part of our tourism industry. So we need to balance that whole process. And this whole idea that ADWR has, that they are going to have 22 planning areas for the Vision Arizona on our water supply. We have some critical issues coming up. And that 5 of those planning areas are active management areas, and the rest of them are these small entities throughout rural Arizona, as if we're not all connected. You know, the Salt River is connected to the water supply of Phoenix. The Verde River is connected to Salt River and the water supply, the Gila River. All of this is part of a larger process. And they know that if they start to run ahead just with these municipal areas planning, that we are going to be left behind in the dust. And I want to be down there to make sure we are not left behind in the dust. I have the knowledge to deal with these issues. I've been dealing with them for a couple of decades, and I've been dealing with them across the spectrum of the western United States.
I think 2 really important things is, one is, I mentioned before about the state keeping control of their water. And then that means the next step is that local communities also keep control of the water, because they live there and they know best how to deal with all these critical issues. And I think we also protect people's individual water rights at the same time. I think those are all important in a freedom atmosphere, to be sure those 3 things happen. Because again, more and more the federal government is wanting to take control of our water here. Another thing is we've got to clean out these waterways. They are clogged and filled up with debris as well, you know, and bushes. Down in Pumpkin Center and down there, the Tonto Basin, they are experiencing terrible flooding periodically because the river is out of its channel now. It's just going clear out of its channel because we haven't been allowed to go in and clean it up. And why aren't we? Because the federal government stops us for a lot of reasons, and it's very difficult.
Well, we are doing that here in the Verde Valley. We have groups out there that have gotten private money and federal money and have been spending millions of dollars a year on cleaning out the exotic species plants throughout the basin. The other issue is water rights and water law. The reality is that Arizona water law, the groundwater underneath your property, according to Arizona water law, is not your water, it's the waters of the state. And so the federal government has nothing to do with that law. It's a state law. And so if we need to change that, then we have to identify that. But that also is water that feeds our rivers and streams. And so the issue there is not just as simple as it appears. The federal government has control of the Colorado River. And that's where our water supply in the future may be. We're going to see shortages. We're talking about desalination. Well, there's a plant being built in San Diego for desalination that's $700 million for 70,000 acre feet. I'll get into it a little bit later.
I want to follow up with something.
Sure, you can. And then
the EPA with the waters of the U.S. that they're now proposing is every ditch, every waterway for runoff for your irrigation, whether it rains, whatever's going on there. If they're able to follow through with that, it will create a whole nother blanket of regulations in our state and a whole other way of controlling it. But again, I go back to the point that if we have local control and local input over our waters, and that is important to do that, keep that at the state and fight those battles at the state, and be sure that we do not allow a real regional or a statewide control of these resources. It's really important that we try to keep control of that locally.
And I agree fully that local control is an important aspect, but it has to be local on a regional basis. Water doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries. Water doesn't understand water law. It understands that if it goes in the ground here, it comes out over here. Or if it gets pumped out over here, this area is going to be affected over a period of time. And so the realities of it are, I agree that what the federal government is proposing, now that's not law today, but it's being proposed that the state of Arizona needs to aggressively be part of that discussion, and that our congressional delegation and our legislative process needs to clearly identify how these will impact Arizona, if they will, in what way, and make sure that our delegation is at the forefront of protecting the rights of Arizona, rural Arizona especially.
Well, it's nice to hear the discussion, because it's a very robust discussion about this issue, and I think we hope that this will be a key environmental issue in the state, whoever is elected from this district, because it is the talk, whether we're in a drought or we're not in a drought, and whether we grow or we don't grow as a state. It's extremely important. So. Changing to one more issue, and we're going to be coming up to closing. I'm going to try to get 2 questions in, so I'm going to tell you to be as tight with your answers as possible before we go to closing statements. Recent healthcare information reported by the state of Arizona indicates that over 300,000 newly insured Arizonans are benefiting by the state's participation in the Affordable Care Act. Of this, over 180,000 of those individuals are newly enrolled in Medicaid or Access program in Arizona. Will you protect Arizona's healthcare expansion and its treatment benefits, especially to those who are mentally ill, because many of them have benefited by this? Or will you support rolling it back, or what you would do and why? And I'll start with Tom on this.
Well, I'll protect it. And I don't believe the Affordable Care Act is not an issue here. Our tax dollars, our fees are going to the federal government. And whether we like the Affordable Care Act or don't like the Affordable Care Act, that's a fact of life. So I don't believe that our taxpayers should be sending $1 billion to Washington, D.C. for them to give money to California, Nevada, and our other competition in the southwestern United States, and our healthcare system not be improved. And so while this is going on, while the federal courts are dealing with the Affordable Care Act, while Congress is trying to deal with the Affordable Care Act, of which there are no guarantees of what the future is going to bring, we need to take advantage of the $1.6 billion that will start to bring back into our state. That money goes back into our healthcare system. It goes to pay for up to 31,000 jobs. It gets dispersed throughout our economy. It gets multiplied. More jobs are created, and more tax revenues come into our state. And our citizens are healthier for it. And so we need to make sure that we fully understand that the battle for affordable care is a Washington battle that we should either support or not support based on our concerns. But the battle for the dollars that are currently our taxpayers are paying is a whole different issue, and we deserve those dollars back.
Sylvia.
Okay, if the feds don't keep their promise about paying for the 100% of this increase. See, they wanted us to take on another load and use some of our tax dollars to help pay for this whole plan of Obamacare. So if the feds don't keep their promise, there's this built-in circuit that's built into it, and then they're just going to kick those people off. And then what happens to those people? They're going to go into the market, they're going to get their insurance in the market, and they'll be subsidized through the market. I don't know that we trust the feds, because the feds' dollar we are experiencing inflation now with our dollar. It has lost a lot of value in the last few years with inflation. And this is just recycled money, taking tax dollars from Arizona people, recycling it back to Washington, bringing it back, and we don't know how long that's going to last. So my question is, what's going to happen to Arizona if this doesn't happen? Well, we say the circuit breaker's there. I think it's kind of funny. It was all right for the federal government to kick them off. I mean, you know, we built that into it if the federal government doesn't keep its promise. But if Arizona can't keep its promise because Arizona doesn't have enough money, or let's say the taxpayers don't have enough money to keep funding this, and then we kick them off, somehow that was a terrible thing. I think we've got ourselves into a mess because we're talking here today about all the demands being made on government. And we want to do all this great education stuff, and we want to do this and we want to do that. But we keep forgetting, where do we get that money from? The blood, sweat, and tears of our taxpayers. And we're going to have to go back to them if this thing does not work and say, we're really short. We're already short this year. And so, I mean, it's a big problem again, and it sounds oh so easy to say, well, we're just going to go down there, we're just going to say, we're just going to fund it. Well, that's what they did before we had the deficit. They just kept funding it and funding it and funding it, and then suddenly one day we didn't have the money. And then, oh, you got all beat up because you had to cut back on state government. You had no choice. There wasn't anything else you could do. So it's just not as easy as it sounds.
I couldn't disagree more.
That's right.
We have a system here that has a circuit breaker built in. Mm-hmm. So if the federal government doesn't live up to its obligation, there is no contractual obligation with the federal government. The blood, sweat, and tears of the taxpayers right now are $1 billion leaving this state and nothing coming back unless we do restoration. So that's valuable money of our citizens that should be in Arizona and not in some other state and not in Washington, D.C., being used for Arizonans and not Californians and people in Nevada. That's number two. Number three, again, I have to say that our healthcare system has a problem. But in 2010, Medicare was cut. Mrs. Allen and the rest of the legislature had to make some cuts, and they chose to take everybody that did not have children off of Medicaid. They're back on Medicaid now, and our system is better off for it, and we have uncompensated care that is much lower than it was before by hundreds of millions of dollars.
And why did we take them off? Why? Because we didn't want to cut education more than 3%. We had no choice. Either cut education more or take them off. Or we could have let the state go bankrupt, or we could have gone out and tried to borrow even more than what we had to borrow to begin with, but we would have had to borrow more. And I go back to saying we wouldn't have had such a big problem if the legislature before, where Mr. Halloran helped vote on those Napolitano budgets, had increased our budget $1 billion every year. It goes all the way back to the money and figuring out how do we handle a certain amount of money the taxpayers give us? How do we use it? And it is difficult, but I believe we did a very good job in a very difficult crisis. And we didn't have people coming to us sitting down like education and saying, hey, how can we help you through this crisis? Instead, it was just getting beat up because we had to make some difficult decisions.
Okay. Thank you. Our last question before we go to closing, I wish we had 2 hours because we could continue on with this. But starting with Sylvia, describe a little bit, very briefly, your approach to problem solving. And I think we won't have a rebuttal on this one. We'll just do 2 minutes if we can. Problem solving when it comes to public policy.
Well, first off,
and working in diverse communities
yes.
and individuals across our
First off, when there's a problem, I just want to solve it. And I get really frustrated when there's so many things stopping you from being able to get a problem solved. I like to sit and talk to people. And I like to, I want people to come and be willing that we work on it. Mm-hmm. And I don't care what party they belong to. I just want to get a problem solved. And so one thing I think is important is to be a good communicator, and I try to do that. And I try to be open and reasonable on things. But I also think we need to have common sense about something and look at things in a common sense way. And I like to ask questions. I want to know, is the taxpayer money being spent worth the return? Are we really fixing the problem we said we were going to fix? Is government is the program solving the problem, and do we need to reform it? Is this a responsibility for local government, for families, for individuals? Should government even take it on? These are the kind of questions you need to ask as you're looking at a problem. Is it better to put this problem down local and give the money straight to the local, like I worked on, how many seconds do I have? A minute, thank you. We took on a pretty big problem for Coconino, Navajo, and Apache County. It was an intoxication task force. Mm-hmm. And we came up with an idea of trying to do something on a local level, a treatment center that we could use on a local level to help people, to help solve this problem. And we couldn't make it happen because we've got the liquor lobby in the way. But my point is, it was a really great effort to try to solve a problem. And I'm going to go back and try to solve problems. And I think if we get the money directly to the counties, have that money flow right to them, then they create the treatment program. I think it would have been successful and could be successful. So what my point is to reform something in a way that it can get right to the problem.
Okay. Tom.
Well, you know, the process has to be identify what the problem is. Whose problem is it? And then bring those people together that are impacted by the problem. Not just special interest groups, but the people that are really impacted by these problems. And then bring experts in, because we like to talk a lot down to the legislature, but we can't be an expert in 200 different issues. So you bring experts in, and then you do the appropriate analysis. What the funding analysis is, what the impact analysis is this solution going to work? Why is it going to work? And then start to develop your legislative package if needed. Don't just jump to regulation. Don't just jump to legislative processes. See what you can do without legislation. If legislation is required, then move to that next level and deal with the legislative realities of life. But detox centers, sadly, have been a problem for decades. We dealt with that in Mojave County. We dealt with it in Coconino County, up by Page especially. And Mrs. Allen is right. For some reason, the lobbying groups in this state from the liquor industry come in and say, well, no, you can't be spending money on that, and you can't do that. Well, that's ridiculous. These are human beings. These are our citizens. These are our neighbors and our friends who happen to have an addiction, and they should be helped. And so, and then I think a lot has to do with everything we do needs to be based on some level of economic analysis and benefit, cost-benefit structure. If we don't do that, we're not going to move forward. I'll give you your 30 seconds.
Okay, with that, and our time is really tight now, so I'm going to put you both to your task of making real clean, crisp closing statements. I appreciate both of you being here today very, very much, and we'll start with Sylvia.
Oh, I thought I went last.
No, you get to go. You get to go first.
Oh, okay. That's fine. Why should I argue with you, Robin? You're in charge. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I want to clear up something because I don't want to give the impression that I feel like that the legislature shouldn't be responsible for what we do, because I've always taken responsibility for every vote I have. I want you to know that I really believe strongly in personal freedom, and I believe that what we do today, it ripples out into the future, and it's going to affect generations. My family is the reason why I do everything, why I've been involved politically, because I really, really want our young people to have the same kind of future and opportunities and chance that I had. And I believe in good principles. I think that if you use the right principle, you're going to get the fruit that you want, and you're going to get good results. And I think that sadly in our state, we have built too much government. We have overregulated, even on the local levels, the county levels. We've been overregulating. We're afraid to trust people. Sometimes we use fear as a motivating factor to try to gain a power in a certain area. And I have spent many years just trying to be involved in the political process and the community to try to make our community better. I believe in strong traditional basic education that is locally controlled. I believe we need to return personal responsibility back to our citizens. It'll free them up. It'll help them to realize their dreams and to have freedom in their life. I have fought for our forest, our industries, our jobs. I have fought for less regulations and fair and equal taxes. I have fought for a secure border. And I don't have to make up my record. I've always been open to everybody about what I believe. I want them to know what I'll do when I go down there. I want them to know what I'll stand for. And I've had a really good relationship with the people that I've served, and they know that I have been able, that they can come to me at any time about anything. I would really appreciate it if I could have your vote on November 4th. And I appreciate the people that are going to be watching this program. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Robin.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, if chosen, given an honor to represent the citizens of this district, I'm looking forward to it. We do, as a state, face many challenges that will affect generations to come. But most importantly, they're going to affect the families of Arizona and our children, and our children's future and our grandchildren's future. And so we have to get out of this whole entire process of looking just out into the future during an election cycle, this 2-year window. We have to look out 10, 20 years and clearly identify how we move the state and position our state so our families can stay together, so our children aren't moving out of the state, so that we are understanding the wonderful state that we live in. I've lived in Arizona. I chose to live in Arizona. I wasn't born here. I said, what of the 50 states do I want to live in? Because I wanted to live in America. And I said, Arizona's where I want to live. And I wanted to live here because of the wonders of Arizona and the people of Arizona. And rural Arizona I chose because it's such a wonderful place to live in. It gives you such a sense of community that you can't believe. But we need to keep that. We need to keep and understand that while still maintaining a future that's bright for our citizens. That our citizens are not paying too many taxes. That our citizens' businesses are successful. And most importantly, that our children's future is something that we all care about as a community. That we make sure that we give them the best chance to succeed in life, and their families the best chance to succeed in life. And we will all be much better off for it. And I ask for your vote. Vote for Tom O'Halloran for State Senate on November 4th. Or before that, if you're doing an early ballot. And thank you, Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you,
Tom.
Thank you both on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greater Verde Valley for you both being here for this wonderful discussion on the issues facing not only our district, but our state. And we've gotten an opportunity, many of us in the Verde Valley know Tom, but it's been wonderful to get to know Sylvia Allen. And thank you to the Verde Valley TV for being our partner in presenting this forum to all of us. And as Tom said, early balloting for the election is still underway. Please get them in the mail by October 31. That's Halloween. And election day is November 4th for voters in Yavapai County. On election day, you can vote at any voting center throughout Yavapai County. For voters in Coconino County, on election day, you can vote at your assigned polling place. Someday we'll work on that too. And most of all, voters, please do vote. Your vote does count. Thank you very much for this wonderful time, and have a good day.
Enjoyed it.